Our next speaker is Ms. DeAnn Stuart, who received her bachelor's and master's from University of Dallas and her PhD from Baylor. And come join us if you would. And she's here to address the gender ideology and indoctrination. So please welcome her. Thank you.
My name is Dr. DeAnn Stuart, as Patrick said, and I'm here as representative of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. We're an academic institute committed to cutting-edge research on the family, marriage, sexuality, and our most fundamental relationships. So my brief remarks today will focus on educational standards currently in place in many Texas schools that address sexual identity with students, beginning in the second grade or earlier, as Carol said, and as early as PK. I've always been taught that before you attack an opponent, you should give that person's argument the most sympathetic reading that you can. So in that spirit, this is how I would roughly summarize the CSE standards for sexual identity. We should teach all Texas students to affirm a wide range of gender identities in order to reduce bullying. In the next 10 minutes or so, my main argument will be that 1, affirming a wide range of gender identities is not backed by good science, and 2, that it has not been proven that implementing these educational standards solves the problem of bullying in Texas schools. So let's begin with statement 1. The main problem with this phrase is that it stands on shaky science. What do we know about gender identity? The national CSE standards give us a definition. But what do we really know about it? The answer is not much. The students we have are mostly recent, small, and flawed. I'll also tell you what we don't know. We don't know what causes people to have the feelings associated with transgender and non-binary identities. Not enough research has been done to determine what the causes of gender dysphoria might be. Is it caused by biology? Are transgender kids born that way? Well, scientists haven't found a transgender gene. And the jury's still out as to whether there's some general genetic propensity toward being transgender, and if so, how weak or strong it is. Scientists also haven't been able to prove that a boy who identifies as a girl really has a girl brain and a boy's body. I have here a summary of a large number of brain studies from the years 2011 to 2015. According to these scientific studies, the brains of transgender individuals are more like the brains of those who share their biological sex than members of the sex with which they identify. And even if scientists find a striking similarity between the brains of a man who identifies as a woman and someone born female, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was the difference there from birth? Or did persistent transgender feelings and behaviors cause those neural pathways and brain structures to shift? We simply don't know, because we don't scan the brains of babies for markers of transgender identities. And we can't really, because we don't know what those markers would be. We don't often scan the brains of children experiencing gender dysphoria. We most often scan adults who have persistently identified as something other than their biological sex for a long time. Teasing apart nature and nurture under those conditions is exceedingly difficult, and it simply has not been done. Let's move on to environment. Could there be certain conditions or environments that trigger a child to identify as transgender? Dr. Kenneth Zucker, a leading Canadian researcher, found that family environments and traumatic experiences can influence a child's transgender identification. The research of Dr. Lisa Littman, a professor at Brown University, suggests that internet and peer groups may influence kids to identify as transgender. There could even be something in our national environment that's encouraging more kids to identify as transgender. Since the transgender phenomenon rose to public attention about 10 years ago, we've seen the number of pediatric gender clinics in the U.S. rise from 1 to 45. This dramatic rise over a very brief period of time has led some scientists to question whether or not we're observing a form of social contagion, especially among adolescent girls, which is where we're seeing huge increases. I didn't use those words social contagion to cause panic. It's a scientific term used to describe the rapid spread of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors through populations as if they were somehow infectious. Simple exposure sometimes appears to be a sufficient condition for social transmission to occur. So said by Dr. Paul Martson. He wrote this in 1998. I bring up these potential environmental influences because school environments also affect kids. I was a public school teacher for 10 years, so I know this firsthand. We can't rule out the possibility that the environment created by the implementation of the CSE standards, which are not backed by good science, could actually be contributing to greater gender confusion and greater numbers of kids visiting the gender clinics. I've heard reports of Texas teachers encouraging students to take an unscientific online quiz to determine where those kids might be on the gender spectrum. Then those kids are plugged into online groups that, according to Dr. Littman's study, may be influencing them to come out as transgender, all without their parents' knowledge. This is bad educational practice backed by bad science. I've heard of pep rallies organized to celebrate transgender kids and of role-playing scenarios that require kids to imagine they are transgender. Are these school environments neutral, or do they push kids in a direction they wouldn't otherwise go in? We don't know. And for that reason, we should be extra cautious and especially deferential to the role of parents, who are the primary educators of their kids. We've looked at gender identity. Now I'd like to examine the word affirm. There's a difference between listening to and caring for a child who identifies as transgender and affirming and assisting their social transition from girl to boy or boy to girl at school. Research shows that 80 to 95% of kids who identify as transgender will stop if they're allowed to make it all the way through puberty without interference. That percentage goes down if their transgender identity is affirmed and they transition socially. That number shrinks to nearly zero if they halt puberty and begin taking cross-sex hormones. While we're still waiting for good and conclusive data on this, some researchers fear that positively affirming a kid's transgender identity early on could prevent them from reconciling with their biological sex and could push children in the direction of identifying as transgender for life. And that course is fraught with dangers and huge unknowns. For example, we don't know the long-term effects of using those powerful puberty-suppressing drugs in ways that they were not originally intended to be used as a secondary use, to use it to halt puberty. And even as Dr. Zucker, who is no conservative and even supports transition for transgender adults, as he says, and I'm paraphrasing, isn't it better if kids can live in harmony with their biological sex instead of taking cross-sex hormones for a lifetime and undergoing invasive and irreversible surgery?
That's right.
Schools should support a kid's reconciliation to his biological sex. And if that reconciliation is at all possible, instead of adopting affirming policies that could potentially push kids away from a life lived in harmony with their bodies. Before wrapping up, I briefly want to look at whether or not the implementation of the CSE identity standards has achieved its aim, which was to reduce bullying in schools. I've read several studies. I don't know of any that have directly measured the impact of the curriculum standards themselves. According to the research I've seen, kids who identify as transgender say the two measures that are most likely to make them feel safer at school are: one, knowing there's a trusted adult on campus that they can talk to, and two, seeing faculty and staff stand up to bullies. We don't need a gender identity curriculum and school-wide pep rallies to stand up to bullies and to let transgender kids know they can talk to someone. I've not thrown a bunch of numbers at you today, but that doesn't mean I don't have them. If you'd like more information about any of the things I said, here's my email address and phone number. You can also reach me via our website at www.austin-institute.org. You'll find a sample of our research-based infographics in the briefing binder. This is where you'll find a lot of the stats. These graphics were excerpted, and you'll see we have a whole bunch of stats arranged in graphic form here so that they're easy to get. These graphics were excerpted from the workbook that accompanies our sexuality and gender workshop. The workbook is available online at Amazon if you need it. To sum up, there's no scientific consensus about what causes a transgender identity, the best ways for medical professionals to treat it, or for parents to respond to it. Schools should not rush in where experts fear to tread. At best, these policies are experimental. At worst, they're indoctrination.
That's right.
And may harm children for life.
That's right.
So thank you for your attention.
That was excellent, DeAnn, and thank you very much. And we are here because we want to make sure that all children have healthy futures and healthy lives growing up and into maturity.